Hey everyone! Tonight we are stepping back into the humid, close air of a wooden mission church in 19th century Aotearoa, the land you probably call New Zealand. You can smell the beeswax candles, the damp wool of the colonial settlers' coats, and the faint, earthy scent of the indigenous Māori people who occupy the back pews. You are sitting there, perhaps stifling a cough, watching the choir. It's an outwardly peaceful scene. A young woman, maybe barely 19, stands poised among the tenors and altos. She is a talented Māori girl, one of the shining stars of the mission school, and she is about to sing a hymn. But tonight, this isn't just worship. This is a battlefield update, delivered in four-part harmony. You hear the organ swell, that deep, resonant sound that vibrates through the floorboards and up your spine. The hymn begins, a familiar call to spiritual arms. Perhaps something about a rock of ages, but Mir's eyes, fixed on the distant hilltops visible through the clear-story windows, hold a silent, heavy knowledge. As the chorus hits, her mouth forms the words differently. The melody is right, the harmony is flawless, but the vowels and consonants shift, subtly altering the meaning of the verse from a prayer of salvation to a coded message. The peak stronghold has lost its first tower. You wouldn't notice it, not unless you knew the original lyrics by heart and spoke fluent Māori. And even then, your mind would trick you into hearing what you expected. This is history's most brilliant, least detectable act of wartime espionage. You probably wouldn't survive this kind of pressure, constantly performing under the eyes of your enemies, turning your faith into a weapon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the tension in the room, a silent vibration beneath the veneer of piety. For the Peak settlers, this church represents civilization, the successful conversion of the Māori from their old ways to the new order. They see Mir as a success story, a testament to their civilizing mission. And that, of course, is precisely her greatest defense. She is their poster child. If the Māori were to suddenly know that the British had suffered an unexpected, devastating loss on the Northern Front, the colonial authorities would hunt down the source of that information with ruthless efficiency. The whole point of the mission school was to instill loyalty, to turn the indigenous population against their own fighting kin. Yet, here is Mir, using the very tool of colonization, the English hymn book, to sustain the resistance. The hymns themselves are a mainstream historical fact of colonial life. They were sung everywhere from military barracks to remote sheep stations. They were the background music of the invasion. What makes Mir's method brilliant is its simplicity and its cultural context. You have to understand that for the Māori song, Waiata wasn't just entertainment. It was history, lineage, and prophecy. To incorporate crucial news into a song was deeply rooted in their cultural traditions, making it an instinctive, reliable form of communication for those who understood the deeper language. The words she is changing are not random. She is targeting specific verses that talk about strength, defeat, or divine wrath. Imagine a hymn verse that originally spoke of God's mighty shield protecting the righteous. Mir, with a slight substitution of the initial consonant and a shift in a vowel sound, is instead singing about the enemy's supply line exposed to the night. The sound is close enough to pass muster, especially since the Peak listeners are focused on the spiritual message, not the military one. This quirky tidbit of linguistic manipulation turns a sacred text into a sophisticated cipher, invisible in plain sight. You watch the mission pastor, a stout man with mutton chop whiskers, his eyes closed in earnest devotion. He believes the sound he is hearing is the affirmation of God's favor for the colonial project. He's listening to the music, not the linguistic minutiae. This is where the core conflict of the New Zealand Wars, or the Māori Land Wars as they are often now called, truly played out in the perception of reality. Historians still argue whether the missionaries were genuinely blinded by their own ideological certainty, or whether a certain level of willful ignorance allowed them to maintain the peace they desperately needed for their work. Either way, Mir is operating within a zone of absolute faith, a gap in the colonial armor that only someone deeply versed in both cultures could exploit. She must keep her face passive, her voice steady, the high notes soaring cleanly above the choir. Her eyes flick to the Mbori elders in the back pews. They catch the shift, they hear the true message, and a minute nod, almost imperceptible, tells her the news has landed. The war is still raging outside these wooden walls, but for a brief moment, the battle is being won. Not with muskets, but with a carefully chosen syllable. The organ fades, the final cadence resolves, and you are left in the ringing silence of the church, knowing you just witnessed a secret exchange of intelligence more valuable than gold. The scene shifts, and you need to understand the volatile ground you are standing on. You are in Aotearoa during the 1860s, a period defined by the conflict known broadly as the New Zealand Wars. This is a battle fundamentally about land and sovereignty, not just a series of skirmishes. The MRRE chiefs had signed the Treaty of Waitangi with the British Crown back in 1840. But interpretations of that treaty differed wildly. To the British, it was a cession of sovereignty. To many Mbori, it was an agreement to share power while retaining ultimate authority over their own territories. Their Tinoranga. When the peak population began to swell, demanding more fertile land, particularly in the rich agricultural areas of the Waikato, the Crown decided to simply take it, often through highly questionable sales and outright confiscation. This is the background noise of Mir's life, the distant, percussive sound of conflict, the constant fear of displacement. You stand at the edge of a colonial settlement, watching British troops march, their red coats and polished brass a stark contrast to the dense green bush they are preparing to enter. The mainstream historical fact here is the policy of land confiscation, or rapato, which drove the fiercest fighting. This act, seen by the Mbori as utterly unjust and a betrayal of the treaty, solidified the resistance movement, particularly the Kinjatanga movement, the creation of Mbori King. Kinji and indigenous political unity meant to stand against the English Queen. This is why the news Mir carries is so crucial. Communication channels are choked by the military presence. Telegraph lines are monitored, roads are patrolled, and letters are intercepted. How do you move information through a hostile, surveilled environment? You make it invisible. The irony of the church environment, remember, is that it is supposed to be neutral territory. But in reality, it's a front line of cultural warfare. The hymns and the Bible translations were themselves part of the attempt to pacify and assimilate. But Mir is turning that assimilation on its head. This is the geopolitical landscape she navigates every time she steps up to the choir stall. A quirky or fringe tidbit often overlooked is that the British military, in their early campaigns, frequently underestimated the advanced defensive engineering of the traditional Mbori fortifications. These weren't just crude stockades, they were sophisticated trench and bunker systems designed to withstand heavy artillery, often leading to embarrassing, costly defeats for the well-equipped imperial forces. These are the victories Mir is trying to celebrate, even if she has to use a psalm about the unshakable fortress of God to do it. Imagine the listeners in the back. They are the families, the elders, the people responsible for keeping the community running while their young men are fighting. They can't afford to look suspicious. Their faces must remain serene, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the pulpit. But when Mir sings a certain melodic phrase and alters the word for lamb to the word for river crossing, they instantly understand that the fighting forces need to consolidate their positions near a major waterway. They are receiving military intelligence cloaked in devotion. The atmosphere is thick with moral complexity. Historians still argue whether the Mbori who attended the mission churches, like Mir, were genuine converts, or whether they used the church simply as a strategic sanctuary and a source of education. For Mir, it was likely both a deep, personal spiritual belief coexisting with an absolute loyalty to her people's fight for survival. This internal duality must have been exhausting, a constant tightrope walk. Every Sunday, she doesn't just put on a choir robe. She puts on a performance of total submission to the colonial power. You see her take a deep breath before the final verse of the morning's hymn. The pastor is looking directly at her, a beam of paternal pride on his face. He sees the future of the colony in her talented voice. But she is seeing the future of her own people. With that breath, she is preparing to deliver the news that a crucial supply of ammunition has been interdicted. She delivers the message in a soaring alto that sounds like pure praise, a beautiful sound of heavenly affirmation. Meanwhile, the listeners in the back of the church are making mental notes about how to distribute the recovered gunpowder. She gives a brief, almost imperceptible smile. It's a gentle moment of sarcasm in this grim war. a victory that smells faintly of incense and old paper. The most dangerous weapon in the war is not a rifle, but a beautifully sung, perfectly altered syllable. You are now privy to the intelligence loop that kept the resistance alive. You follow Mira away from the church, watching her transition from the angelic choir girl to a regular young woman navigating a divided settlement. Her fluency in both worlds is not just a skill, it's a necessary armor. Mira's early life, the focus of this section, was steeped in this dual reality. She was likely born in or near a traditional settlement, a kanga, but was brought up increasingly under the shadow of the mission station. The mission schools in the mainstream historical fact of the era were highly successful educational institutions for Mbori offering literacy in both English and, significantly, their own language, Te Reo Mabori, which had been codified into a written form by missionaries themselves. This education gave Mir access to the colonial mind, to the structure of the English language, and crucially, to the architecture of the translated hymns. Imagine her childhood, days spent learning the names of distant European saints and the geography of the Holy Land, juxtaposed with evenings hearing the traditional Carrero stories and histories of her own elders, tales of ancestors and tribal boundaries. This blended environment honed her exceptional ability to code switch, not just linguistically, but culturally. She knows exactly how the PK mind works, what they listen for, and what they dismiss. She knows that to the missionaries, the mana prestige power of their hymns lay in their perceived divine inspiration, making the literal words secondary to the feeling of piety they generated. The mission community provided Mir with more than just education. It provided her with a nearly impenetrable cover. Who would suspect the star pupil, the diligent chorister, of sedition? She is indispensable. She plays the harmonium for practice, helps mend the choir robes, and tutors the younger children in scripture. This proximity to the colonial authority is a quirky or fringe tidbit of wartime intelligence gathering. The most effective spies are often those who are seen constantly but never truly looked at. Mir's position gives her access to conversations. Scraps of information chatter about troop movements overheard while serving tea to the pastor's wife, or complaints about supply ship delays from a disgruntled officer attending Sunday service. You notice how she carries herself, quiet, respectful, and always slightly reserved. This demeanor is a shield. If she were too spirited or too outspoken, she would risk drawing suspicion. Her silence is interpreted as modesty or reverence, but you know it's focused concentration, the constant processing of information. She is memorizing the specific melodic structure of each hymn, identifying which words fall on which key beats, making sure that her substituted syllables maintain the integrity of the rhythm and the rhyme scheme in English even as they transmit a clear message in Mbori. This highlights the intellectual challenge she faces. It's not just a matter of swapping one word for another. She has to ensure that the Mbori word or phrase she inserts has the correct number of syllables and the appropriate stress pattern to match the original English meter. If the original sings, "He shall deliver," she must find a Mbori phrase that carries the message. Say, "The scout returns," that fits the Doda-Dade rhythm. Historians still argue whether this specific linguistic ingenuity was taught or was a purely self-developed method, but its efficacy is undeniable. You see her pause by a low stone wall, glancing toward the hills where the fighting is happening. For a brief moment, the mask slips, and you see the weight of her role, the fear for her people, the commitment to the resistance, and the relentless pressure of living a double life. She is a bridge between two warring worlds, and that bridge is built of perfectly articulated, carefully chosen sounds. She walks on, returning to the mission compound, ready to use the next choir rehearsal not for praise, but for planning. She is not just a participant in the war. She is the messenger pigeon, carrying news through the eye of the storm. The stage is set for the transformation of the ordinary into the essential. You are watching Mir prepare for a choir practice, and this is where the hymn book ceases to be merely a collection of sacred songs and becomes a Trojan horse. Think about the nature of hymns in that era. They were ubiquitous, memorized by rote, and performed with intense mechanical repetition. This mainstream historical fact is precisely what makes them the ideal cover. Repetition deadens attention. If you sing the same four stanzas every week, your brain stops truly listening to the individual words and focuses instead on the rhythm, the harmony, and the collective feeling of worship. This cognitive complacency on the part of the PK's congregation is Mir's greatest asset. They expect to hear the words of Isaac Watts or Charles Wesley. Their expectation acts as a natural censor. But the Mbori listeners, who understand the subtleties of their own language and the cultural tradition of coded Waiata, are primed to listen for the slightest deviation. They are waiting for the unfamiliar within the familiar. You watch Mir run her fingers over the stiff pages of the hymnal. She isn't just reading the notes, she is mapping the sonic possibilities. She knows, for example, that the English word glory geolary might be replaced by a Mbori word like ingaro, hidden, lost, or kori nun, negation. The sounds are close enough to be acoustically ambiguous in a large, echoing church setting, especially when blended with other voices. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit of Mir's genius. She understood acoustics and vocal blending as much as she understood military intelligence. The alto part, her usual position, is perfectly suited for subtle sonic shifts. It's high enough to be heard over the tenors and basses, but not so dominant as to draw the kind of direct attention the soprano line receives. The hymns, in their widespread distribution, also created an instant decentralized network. Imagine a settler family traveling from one remote coastal town to another. They bring their hymnal, they attend the local mission church, and they sing the familiar tunes. But the Mbori members of the congregation, who know Mir's network, are listening for the recent updates. The encoded information is self-replicating. It spreads with every service. Every traveling choir member, every time a hymn is sung in a new location. It is an oral, viral dissemination method that leaves no paper trail, no encrypted message to crack. Historians still argue whether the hymnbook's use as a political tool was unique to Mir's region, or if similar methods of covert communication were adopted in other parts of Aotearoa during the conflicts. The difficulty in proving it, of course, is that the evidence vanished as soon as the sound waves dissipated. You see a young Mbori girl, a nervous soprano in the back row, accidentally sing the correct original word during practice. Mir doesn't scold her, she simply stops the music gently. "No, dear," she says in flawless English. The emphasis goes on the second syllable in that line, not the first. Try to feel the rhythm of God's grace. Then, in a moment only the initiated understand, she glances at the girl and very softly, almost under her breath, in Maori, sings the altered line, emphasizing the message that the girl missed. This is training, subtle and relentless. The choir director, standing at the front, simply nods, satisfied with Mir's dedication to vocal precision. He is listening to the music. Mir is using the music as a cloak. The complexity lies not just in the linguistic shift, but in the maintenance of the message's relevance. News doesn't age well in wartime. An update about a skirmish last week is useless today. Mir has to constantly receive new intelligence from runners who slip in and out of the settlement, often under the guise of trading or visiting relatives. She processes the information: which tribe, which location, what material law sent, then quickly maps it onto the repertoire of hymns scheduled for the next service. The familiar cadence of Amazing Grace might become the bearer of devastating news about a shortage of food, sung with exactly the same tone of spiritual resignation that the original lyrics demanded. The result is a seamless, subversive performance of devotion. The critical moment arrives not in a dramatic explosion, but in a near-silent shift of sound. You are sitting in the church, anticipating the familiar movement of the service. The hymn chosen is one of steady, enduring faith, something about the eternal strength of the Lord. Mir steps up, and you focus, straining to catch the alteration. The mainstream historical fact is that the first significant Mbori resistance came from figures who refused to sell their land, igniting the Taranaki War in 1860, years before the full conflict erupted in Waikato. Early losses for the Crown, while strategically minor, were huge morale boosters for the Mbori. This is the kind of news Mir needs to deliver now. The original line, perhaps sung by 1,000 congregations across the empire, spoke of the peace that passeth all understanding. A lovely, reassuring phrase. But the message Mir is delivering concerns a minor colonial outpost that has been abandoned due to constant harassment and a failure of resupply, a tiny but tangible victory for the resistance. You hear her voice, sweet and perfectly pitched, carrying the alto line. When the key phrase arrives, the word for peace, peas, is subtly replaced with a sound that translates not to its opposite, but to something linguistically close, yet semantically devastating. The small camp is empty. The guns are silent. The sound is a fractional substitution, changing the emphasis just enough. This is the first alteration, a tentative step into espionage. The specific brilliance here lies in the loresque nature of the change. A quirky or fringe tidbit that helped Mir was the regional variation in English pronunciation, even among the PK. In the 19th century, colonial accents were still developing, making slight differences in vowel sounds less noticeable to the average listener. If the word PS piece was sometimes pronounced closer to pies or peas, depending on the speaker's regional English dialect, the slight shift to a related Mbori syllable would be almost undetectable in the collective sound of the choir. She is exploiting the instability of colonial language itself. You look around, no one registers the change. The PKs are engrossed in their prayer books, perhaps mentally calculating their sheep inventory or debating the price of wool. The choir director is focused on keeping the basses from flatting. Only the handful of listeners in the back, the elders who know the secret, feel the internal jolt. They don't just hear the news, they experience a moment of exhilarating, defiant survival. They are being told, publicly, in the midst of their enemies, that their resistance is working. This initial alteration is a test. Is her method sound? Will anyone notice? She performs the substitution with absolute calm, her breathing controlled, her eyes fixed on the conductor. This is the moment she crosses the line from sympathizer to active combatant. The consequences, if she were caught, would be imprisonment or worse, for treason. Yet her expression is one of devout serenity. Historians still argue whether the Mbori communities involved recognized Mir's service as equal in importance to that of the men who fought on the Pa fortifications. It was a different kind of bravery, requiring steady nerves rather than brute force. But the intelligence she delivered was foundational to the coordinated efforts of the Kinjatanga. You witness the end of the stanza. The choir swells, covering the initial subtle shift. The peak listeners sigh contentedly, feeling spiritually uplifted. They think they have been moved by the purity of the message. They have been moved but by news of colonial failure. Mir has successfully weaponized a hymn. As the notes fade, you realize that the real war is not just happening in the bush, but here, in the sound waves of a simple Sunday service. The success of this first small alteration, a minor but significant loss, signaled through song, paved the way for the sophisticated coding system that would follow. She knows now that the hymnal is secure, the peaks are deaf, and the network can begin to trust the system. You now turn your focus to the unwitting collaborators in Mir's espionage, the missionaries themselves. You are observing the senior pastor, the Rev. Mr. Davies, a man whose entire worldview rests on the absolute efficacy of his evangelical work. For him, the success of the choir, the beautiful harmonization, and the attendance of Mbori converts is not just proof of God's grace, but proof of colonial moral superiority. This profound, self-serving conviction is Mir's second greatest shield. The mainstream historical fact is that the colonial missionaries genuinely believed their spiritual influence would permanently pacify the Mbori, making military conflict unnecessary, or at least marginal. They saw their role as civilizers, and every converted Mbori, especially one as talented as Mir, was a personal victory over what they termed heathenism. This blind spot is crucial. The missionaries viewed the hymns as instruments of God's truth, immutable and powerful. The idea that a convert, someone they had personally educated and mentored, would subvert the sacred text for political and military ends was simply unthinkable, a theological impossibility. They suffered from profound confirmation bias. They heard the notes, they heard the devotional tone, and their minds supplied the expected orthodox words. Their belief in the manna spiritual power of their own sermons and songs was so absolute that they became functionally deaf to subtle linguistic treason. Consider the quirky or fringe tidbit of how these hymns were often translated. The original English lyrics frequently contained complex, abstract theological concepts that had no direct equivalent in Te Reo Mu. Missionaries often had to take great liberties with translation, using existing Mbori concepts and vocabulary that had spiritual significance within the indigenous worldview. For instance, the Christian concept of redemption might be translated using a Mowbray word that also implied restoration, or reclaiming ancestral land. This ambiguity, born from translation necessity, became a linguistic playground for Mir. She knew exactly which translated words already carried a double meaning, one acceptable to the peak, and one secretly resonant with the Mbori struggle. You watch Rev Davies beam during a service, particularly when Mir sings a soaring solo. He is completely absorbed in his own sense of accomplishment. Historians still argue whether the missionaries' blindness was purely naive faith, or if some in the lower ranks had nagging, suppressed doubts that they dared not voice for fear of undermining the entire mission structure. If they admitted that the Mbori were still secretly resistant, their funding would dry up, and their life's work would be deemed a failure. Mir is exploiting this professional fragility. She is betting her life on the fact that Rev Davies needs her to be a success story more than he needs her to be. Loyal to the crown if the British authorities found out about the coded songs. The missionaries would be the first to be discredited and perhaps even expelled. This shared, if unspoken, investment in the illusion of conversion gives Mir a protective layer. She can joke inwardly, a gentle layer of sarcasm reserved only for you, the listener, that the colonial strategy convert the natives and they will fight your wars, for Yuhas actually provided the Māori resistance with their most effective courier service. It's like using the enemy's postal system to deliver plans for sabotaging their bridges. The sound of the organ fills the church, vibrating through the wooden benches. You feel the deep conviction of the peak congregation, their absolute certainty that God is on their side, securing their land. But with every altered syllable that Mir sings, she is sending a signal that this certainty is dangerously misplaced. She's using the very language of their faith to tell the fighters in the bush that God, or at least the ancestors, are still watching over the cause. You realize that Mir's true performance is not the singing, but the mask of devotion she wears. A mask that convinces those in charge that their mission has been a flawless, total success. Mir's methods cannot remain static. They must evolve to survive scrutiny. If she keeps using the same handful of syllable shifts, even the dullest peak mind might eventually catch on, especially if troop movements repeatedly correlate with certain hymn verses. Therefore, she moves from simple substitution to a complex, internally consistent code built around rhyme and rhythm. You are now watching her during a late-night study session, not with the Bible, but with a battered, annotated copy of hymns ancient and modern. The initial method was purely acoustic one sound, swapping for another. But the sophisticated code she now develops hinges on associating a specific religious image in the original lyric with a known military element in the war. For example, if the hymn stanza uses the word river of life, Mir might consistently substitute a phrase that rhymes in Mbori, translating not to a divine concept, but to a specific river important to the campaign. Perhaps the Wapib or the Waikato, the peak here, flowing water, a spiritual metaphor. The Mbori hear the name of the river and are prepared for a rendezvous or a skirmish in that specific geographical area. This focus on rhyme and rhythm is a mainstream historical fact of poetry and song in all cultures, providing an easily memorable structure. Mir exploits this mnemonic power. If the original line has a very strong endrum-like sight and night, she ensures her coded message also maintains that perfect, almost sing-song rhythm, but the meaning has been inverted. She might link the concept of the shepherd in the hymn to the name of a specific Mbori leader, a protector, and the concept of wandering sheep to a tribe that has become displaced. She is creating a dictionary of metaphors that only the initiated understand. The depth of the code also extends to the musical structure. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the way she starts using minor key variations. If the hymn is normally sung in a cheerful major key and she slips in a temporary shift to a minor third during the coded line, this musical change acts as a linguistic marker for her Mbori listeners. It's like putting the message in italics. The peak musicians, being less focused on the subtle modal shifts of the Anglican repertoire, might just think it's a momentary harmonic color, but the Mbori know. Listen now, the news is bad or urgent. The use of dissonance or an unresolving chord could signal a stalemate or an impending ambush. You can almost see the gears turning in her mind. This is far more complex than a simple substitution cipher. It requires her to constantly update her key based on current events and the changing nature of the war. She links known military figures to specific religious figures. General Cameron, the British commander, might always be coded as Pharaoh or Goliath, while Kanji Tweo, the Mbori king, might be David or Moses. This is not just news delivery. It is moral-boosting propaganda embedded within the most sacred of colonial texts. Historians still argue whether the Māori listeners understood these codes instantaneously, or if a small, dedicated group was responsible for deciphering the messages after the service and disseminating the literal intelligence. The effectiveness suggests near instantaneous recognition. Relying on the deep cultural knowledge of Waiata and the known pre-agreed associations, imagine the strain. Mir must not only sing the intricate harmony perfectly, but she must also simultaneously translate a piece of urgent military intelligence, fit it into a specific rhythmic and rhyming scheme, and then execute the performance with total, unwavering composure. This is like solving a quadratic equation while juggling flaming torches. She sometimes allows herself a gentle, almost invisible smile when she successfully maps a complex British retreat onto a hymn stanza about the retreat of Satan's host. A little sarcasm is essential to survive this kind of pressure. The choir practice ends. She closes the book, the heavy leather binding, securing the secrets within. The peak director thanks her for her flawless pitch. He's listening for the melody. You know, she just announced that General Cameron's supply lines are stretched thin near the Waipieb River. The code is secure, for now. You are now moving toward one of the most famous events of the New Zealand Wars, the Battle of Gapop Kukunahina in 1864. This was a pivotal moment. A stunning Māori defensive victory against overwhelming British forces, a mainstream historical fact, often taught as a lesson in ingenious indigenous military strategy. Mir's task here is massive, to convey not just that a battle occurred, but that a heavily entrenched British force was routed, a monumental psychological blow to the colonial project. The setup is tense. Word has reached Mir that the defenders at Gapop, near Tauranga, have done the unthinkable. They dug sophisticated, covered rifle pits and bunkers that completely negated the British artillery superiority. When the British charged, believing the position was softened up, they walked straight into a kill zone. The resulting retreat was chaotic and humiliating for the Empire. Mir knows she must act swiftly and clearly. She selects a hymn often sung during times of fasting or spiritual cleansing, usually one focused on the unshakable foundation of the Christian faith. She chooses a verse that speaks of the fall of the wicked and the triumph of the righteous remnant. She substitutes the word for wicked, peaking military with a phrase that directly refers to the British general and righteous remnant. Māori defenders with the specific geographic location of Gapop. The altered line, sung with dramatic soaring passion, translates roughly to, at the place of the Pa. The great commander was humbled and fled. The difference this time is the scale of the news. This is not a subtle, subtly line disruption. This is a catastrophic victory for the resistance. The challenge is delivering the message with enough force to convey the joy and magnitude of the triumph without breaking her calm demeanor. She allows her voice to carry a slight, controlled edge of elation, which the peak attribute to spiritual ecstasy. The quirky or fringe tidbit surrounding Gapop involves the famous story of the Māori fighters offering water to the wounded British officers, including the dying Lieutenant Colonel Booth after the fighting had ceased. This act of chivalry, demonstrating Takanga Māori custom and correct behavior, even in war, was so shocking and commendable that it was reported widely in colonial newspapers, momentarily forcing the settlers to confront the humanity of their enemy. Mir's coded song might have referenced this specific act, perhaps by substituting a line about quenching the thirst of the weary soul with a message about showing honor and victory, reminding her people that the fight for land was not a fight against honor. The tension in the church is palpable, though only a few know why. The Māori listeners are struggling to maintain their composure. You see an elder in the back pew, tears streaming silently down his face, stares, not of sorrow, but of fierce, defiant pride. He is performing his own kind of resistance by sitting absolutely still, absorbing the message. Historians still argue whether the Māori commanders were aware of Mir's communication network, or if this type of intelligence sharing was an independently organized civilian effort. What is clear is that the victory at Gapop disseminated instantly to other resisting communities through this quiet, musical network, provided a tremendous boost to morale, and encouraged further defensive stands in the subsequent campaigns. You watch as the service concludes. The Reverend praises the choir's performance, particularly Mir's impassioned delivery. He notes how powerfully the music moved him, how he felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. He feels affirmed. He has just unwittingly sanctioned the transmission of news that will prolong the very war he wants to end. It's a classic example of gentle sarcasm. The pastor believes he is praising God, but he is actually praising the efficiency of Mbori wartime communication. Mir collects her hymnal and steps out into the sunlight, carrying the good news of a tragic victory tucked neatly between the staves of sheet music. The successful larger-scale delivery of the Gatepot news proved Mir couldn't handle this alone. To ensure the intelligence was disseminated rapidly and accurately across multiple remote settlements, she had to establish a small, trusted network within the choir. You are now observing the logistics of this operation, a hidden command structure operating right under the noses of the colonial authorities. This network, perhaps only 3 or 4 other young Mbori women, were not just singers. They were meticulously trained couriers of sound. The mainstream historical fact is that traditional Mbori society was organized around strong kinship groups, Huno and Happer, which maintained deep lines of communication across territories, often relying on intricate trails and waterways. Mir's choir network simply piggybacked onto this pre-existing infrastructure. Her choristers were chosen carefully. They needed to be musically adept, fluent in both English and Mbori, and most importantly, have impeccable cover stories that allowed them to travel between mission settlements. One might claim to be visiting a sick aunt, another delivering embroidered linens for the pastor's wife in a neighboring town. Their movement was seen as routine, pastoral errands. The training involved hours of what appeared to be innocuous choral practice. Mir didn't use written notes for the code. The sheer danger was too high. Instead, she drilled the specific rhythmic and pitch alterations into her couriers, using repetition and association. For instance, she might tell the soprano, Henny, that whenever she hears the word fortress, she must sing a phrase that rhymes in Muir and associates with supply cache. If Henny travels to a different district, she is responsible for integrating that coded message into the local mission's repertoire. This distributed singing strategy, this choir network, ensured that no single person carried the entire weight of the code, protecting the system from collapse if one member was caught. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the way they used common household objects or traditional crafts as secondary confirmation. If a chorister was delivering a message about a shortage of gunpowder, she might carry a basket woven with a very specific traditional pattern that symbolized emptiness or famine, a visual nonverbal confirmation that the auditory message was authentic and urgent. This multi-layered security made the intelligence highly reliable. You observe Mir and Henny during a quiet moment after practice. Henny is clearly anxious. "What if I forget the kupu word?" she whispers in Mbori. Mir gently reassures her. The message is in the music. "Henny, if you forget the kupu, sing the feeling. Sing strength when we speak of our king, and silence when we speak of their guns." This reliance on emotional resonance as a memory aid is critical. Historians still argue whether the British military had intelligence agents who were aware of the sophistication of Mbori oral communication, or if they were solely focused on intercepting written or telegraphic messages, proving their deep underestimation of indigenous communication methods. It is a historical testament to their tunnel vision. The success of the network depended on perfect integration. You are listening to Henny sing a traditional English anthem, her voice blending seamlessly. She hits the coded phrase, a flawless substitution of a syllable that communicates the location of a key meeting point for the resistance. The peak congregation simply hears a beautiful, uplifting chorus. The Makori listeners hear the coordinates. It's a remarkable feat of cultural dexterity and nerves of steel. You can almost feel the relief of the elders in the receiving community, the anxiety of waiting for news, finally broken by the purity of a young woman's voice carrying vital information. Mir has transformed a religious ritual into a sophisticated, decentralized wartime communication hub. The success of Mir's network hinged on the peak suspicion remaining just that vague, unformed suspicion, an eerie feeling in the air rather than a concrete proof. You are now observing the rising anxiety in the colonial congregation. The mainstream historical fact is that the European settlers were receiving contradictory information. Official British reports consistently painted a picture of inevitable victory and swift pacification. Yet the actual war effort dragged on, punctuated by unexpected demoralizing setbacks like Gatepot. This discrepancy created a constant state of unease. The suspicion didn't fall on Mir immediately, but on the atmosphere of the church itself. Settlers would leave the Sunday service feeling inexplicably agitated. They would comment that the Māori converts seemed too cheerful after bad news, or that certain hymns sounded strangely mournful when the official reports were positive. It was a cognitive dissonance they couldn't resolve. One settler might mention to another, "Did you notice the way those elders smiled during the hymn about crossing the dark river? It felt ... wrong." You are listening to a conversation between two Peak women after a service. "I don't know," says one, adjusting her bonnet, "but sometimes I feel like they are singing a different song than us. The sound is beautiful, but the feeling is not Christian submission. It's defiance." This is the eerie feeling Mir cultivated. Her brilliance was in ensuring that deviation was always emotional and tonal, rather than explicitly linguistic. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the strange case of the mission dog. One pastor had a faithful terrier that would normally sit quietly during services. During the period of Mir's most active coding, the dog reportedly became agitated during specific hymns, whimpering or scratching at the door, only to settle down for the sermon. Local settlers began to superstitiously link the dog's behavior to moments of spiritual turbulence in the church. The dog, likely reacting to the subtle, high-pitched vocal or rhythmic shifts Mir used as markers, became an unconscious, non-human detector of the code's execution. This period was Mir's most dangerous. She couldn't afford a direct accusation. She had to manage not just the Māori message, but the peak perception of herself. She amplified her visible piety, volunteering more hours, offering extra assistance to the pastor's family, and visibly correcting any lapses in decorum among the younger Māori children. She was giving the settlers extra reasons to dismiss their own rising anxiety. Historians still argue whether the settlers' suspicion was purely a product of wartime paranoia, or if some astute individuals were genuinely close to cracking the code, only to be stopped by the sheer social unthinkability of a loyal convert being a master spy. You watch as the choir director, the man most exposed to the music, expresses his vague concern to Rev. Davies. "Reverend," he says, "I know Miss Mir is a treasure, but sometimes, when the choir sings certain passages, the harmony, well, it feels unsettled, almost out of key, but not quite. I can't put my finger on it. Perhaps it's just the stress of the war affecting the acoustics." The director is sensing the minor key variations, the tonal markers, but he dismisses it as a technical flaw or an atmospheric disturbance, exactly as Mir intends. She offers the two men a cup of tea, her hand perfectly steady. She knows she must keep the suspicion generalized. If it becomes focused on the words, she is lost. If it remains focused on a strange feeling or bad harmony, it will be dismissed as neurosis or acoustics. Her performance of calm servitude is the anchor that prevents the vague suspicion from turning into dangerous certainty. She even offers a gentle, self-deprecating joke about the need for more practice to perfect the Lord's sound, gently deflecting the blame onto her own musical skills rather than the lyrics. She understands that in this environment, perception is the only reality. To appreciate the linguistic tightrope Mir walked, you must understand the role of the Māori translators in the creation of the very hymns she was subverting. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. The Bible and the hymns were not translated by Peak in isolation. They relied heavily on the collaboration of highly educated bilingual Māori scholars and chiefs. This partnership, initiated early in the 19th century, was driven by a genuine desire by the Māori to understand and engage with the new religion, resulting in a meticulously translated Bible in Te Reo Māori that was highly accurate and respected. You see a dusty original printing of the Māori hymnal, with the words set out clearly. The Māori translators were masters of their own language, choosing vocabulary that was spiritually evocative and technically precise. They wrestled with concepts like grace and Trinity, finding appropriate cultural equivalents. This intimate involvement meant that the translated Māori hymns were not merely transliterations of English sounds, but powerful, poetic works of literature in their own right. This gave Mir an unparalleled advantage. Because Māori scholars had been responsible for selecting the words, Mir knew which particular words were the most vulnerable to double meaning, or had close phonetic ties to other important, yet secular, Māori terms. For example, a word chosen for salvation might have a subtle secondary meaning related to protection from the sea, and Mir could shift its usage slightly to signal news about a coastal defense strategy. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this era is the extraordinary pace at which Mbori literacy grew. Within a few decades of the introduction of writing, Mbori communities achieved a higher literacy rate than many parts of Britain. They devoured the printed word, particularly the Bible and the hymnals. This widespread literacy, intended by the missionaries to spread the gospel, meant that Mir's audience was also highly attuned to the printed structure and the precise vocabulary of the texts, making them hyper-aware of any deviations from the established translation. They could spot a purposeful linguistic irregularity instantly, confirming the hidden message. Imagine the level of intellectual play Mir engaged in. She's not just swapping out words, she's exploiting the very structure of the translated language, using her deep understanding of Mbori phonetics and semantics. If the original translator chose a six-syllable phrase to represent a complex English concept, Mir had 6 syllables of rhythmic space to embed her military message. It was a constraint that forced elegant solutions. Historians still argue whether the Mbori translators, some of whom later became resistance leaders themselves, intentionally left linguistic trapdoors or ambiguities within the sacred texts, anticipating the eventual need to use these spiritual documents for temporal political communication. Whether intentional or not, Mir found and exploited those vulnerabilities perfectly. You see her, perhaps in the dead of night, practicing her substitutions by candlelight. She is ensuring that the new coded phrase in Te Reo Mbori doesn't sound awkward or ungrammatical to her indigenous listeners, even as it must maintain the rhythm and vowel structure of the original English text for the PK. She is a master philologist disguised as a choir girl. She takes a phrase meant to praise the everlasting King, and with a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the initial consonant of the main verb, transforms it into an instruction. Send aid to the gathering place of the king. She is using the majesty of the translated word, a tool of colonization, as a vehicle for the defense of her own sovereignty. It is the ultimate act of cultural jujitsu. The resistance suffered a truly devastating blow at the Battle of Rangieri in November 1863, mainstream historical fact that marked a turning point in the Waikato War and resulted in the capture of hundreds of Mbori fighters. Mir now faces her greatest challenge, conveying the sheer scale of this loss, not as a defiant triumph, but as a genuine tragedy, a dirge in disguise. The colonial authorities were elated. This was the victory they had been waiting for. The mission church was likely filled with peak settlers, brimming with triumphalist zeal, expecting a hymn of thanksgiving for God's clear favor on the crown. You feel the heaviness in the air as Mir steps forward. She has received the dreadful news. The PA was breached, the commander captured, and the core of the Kinjatanga forces severely weakened. This cannot be coded as a minor setback. It must be a communication of deep, collective mourning and a call to regroup. She chooses a familiar funeral hymn, one usually reserved for the passing of an elder, focusing on verses that speak of loss, suffering, and the long road home. Her alteration is profound this time. Instead of simple substitution, she changes the semantic focus of entire where the original spoke of the soul, finding rest in the Lord's peaceful domain, she substitutes a Maori phrase that laments the loss of the ancestral domain when Wua, the land itself. The phrase, while maintaining the correct melody and rhythm, translates heartbreakingly to, "Our children are captive. The river Waikato is now stained with our blood." The sound remains somber, appropriate for a funeral hymn, but the content is raw, immediate, and geographically specific. A quirky or fringe tidbit associated with Rangieri is that after the battle, the captive Mbori fighters were transported to a hulk ship in the Waitmat harbor before being sent to exile on the remote island of Kauau. Mir's coded dirge may have subtly referenced this transportation, perhaps linking the hymn's imagery of sailing to the heavenly shore with the grim reality of sailing to the cold prison. You are acutely aware of the risk she is taking. The emotional weight of the Rangieri defeat is immense, and maintaining the facade of spiritual sorrow while conveying real, devastating military defeat requires absolute control. Her voice wavers slightly, but only enough to be interpreted as profound religious feeling. She is transforming her personal grief into a public act of intelligence reporting. Historians still argue whether the severity of the intelligence Mir distributed following Rangieri led to a strategic shift in the remaining Kinjatanga resistance, forcing them to adopt purely guerrilla tactics instead of attempting further large-scale fixed-position pod defenses. The message was clear: large confrontations were no longer viable. You watch the peak listeners. They are moved by the music, perhaps shedding a tear for their own pious reasons, completely oblivious that they are participating in a collective moment of indigenous national mourning and receiving a military situation report. This is where the gentle sarcasm turns dark. The colonial conquerors are being emotionally manipulated by the very people they believe they have subdued, grieving the loss of the indigenous fighters while believing they are grieving for some distant, abstract spiritual failing. Mir, by singing this beautiful disguised lament, provides the necessary emotional release and the essential tactical, warning her people desperately need to survive the next phase of the war. The emotional toll of this double life, especially after delivering the news of a defeat as catastrophic as Ranjari pushes Mir into a continuous state of internal debate. You watch her struggle with the weight of her actions, the conflict between her genuine faith and her unwavering commitment to her people. This isn't just a political strategy, it's a profound ethical dilemma. She is using the language of God to deliver messages of war. In the solitude of her room, Mir faces this internal tension. The mainstream historical fact is that the Christian faith, once adopted by many Mbori, became deeply intertwined with indigenous concepts of spirituality and justice. Missionaries presented God as a source of strength, but Mir is aware that the God she prays to is now also the God she is actively deceiving the followers of. Is it permissible to defile a sacred text even subtly? The goal is the survival of her culture and the defense of their ancestral lands. When she draws strength from the Mbori cultural perspective that places supreme value on Manakatunga hospitality, generosity, and care for others, and Tino Rangatoratanga, self-determination. She rationalizes her deception not as an act against God, but as an act for her people, an essential form of Manakatunga for the fighters and their families. Her faith is not abandoned. It is repurposed. She views the colonial interpretation of the Bible as another tool of oppression, and her subversion as reclaiming the truth, a quirky or fringe tidbit that often sustained resistance fighters, and likely was the development of syncretic religious movements, like the Hau faith, which blended Christian and traditional Mbori beliefs, sometimes emphasizing prophetic visions and resistance themes. While Mir remains within the mission structure, the existence of such movements indicates a broader societal willingness to adapt and redefine faith in the face of colonial aggression. She knows her internal struggle is part of a larger, collective spiritual reevaluation. You can sense her emotional fatigue. The relentless pressure of living a lie is a burden she carries with every sung note. She finds herself praying not just for the souls of the departed, but for the strength to continue her deception. Historians still argue whether Mir ever sought consultation or approval from a religious authority within the Mbori resistance, like a prophet or Tuhunga expert, priest, to validate the spiritual morality of her espionage. It's likely she carried this burden of ethical responsibility entirely alone. Imagine her sitting at the piano during a practice session, her hands moving over the keys, playing a devotional tune. She pauses, rereads a stanza, and frowns. The original English speaks of submitting to the master's will. She changes the Mbori phrasing to refer to the master of the canoe, a metaphor for the leader of the people, demanding obedience not to the crown, but to the kanji. It's an agonizing process, filtering her spiritual devotion through the demands of military survival. This internal conflict provides her performance with its raw, undeniable emotional power. The peak listeners hear her singing with such profound feeling, because she is singing with profound feeling, just not the feeling they assume. She is pouring her moral agony and her unwavering loyalty into the melody. Her sarcasm here is quiet, almost tragic. She is giving the colonists the show of devotion they demand, while simultaneously ensuring their defeat. The silence in her room is the only space where Mir, the spy, can briefly drop the mask of Mir, the faithful choir girl. The danger Mir faces is amplified by the widespread atmosphere of colonial censorship and control over the printed word. This is not a peripheral issue. It is a mainstream historical fact that colonial administrations, realizing the power of information, actively sought to suppress any news that undermined their authority or boosted Mbori morale. You see this in the heavily monitored postal system and the stringent control over the few newspapers published in the settlements. Imagine the colonial administration's fear. If the official narrative of swift, inevitable conquest collapses, investment will dry up, new settlers won't arrive, and the war will become politically untenable back in London. Therefore, all communication regarding military losses, the true extent of Rapatu land confiscation, or successful Mbori resistance is heavily filtered. Official reports are often delayed, sanitized, or outright fabricated to maintain the illusion of control. This environment of deliberate disinformation intensifies the need for Mir's oral invisible communication system. Because the colonists trusted the printed word and had less respect for the indigenous oral traditions, their censorship efforts focused almost exclusively on the press and telegraphy. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the strange case of Te Hokioi, an early Mbora language newspaper established by the Kinjatanga movement to counter colonial media propaganda. This paper, though quickly suppressed and difficult to distribute, showed that the Mbori leadership was keenly aware of the need to manage their own narrative. Mir's coded hymns are, in effect, a highly successful, completely undetectable version of Te Hokioi, an oral and musical counter-narrative. You understand the paradox. The more the colonial government tried to control the written word, the more effective Mir's sung word became. A runner carrying a coded letter risked being searched, interrogated, and executed. A choir girl traveling to the next town to assist with a missionary concert carried the intelligence encoded in her memory, ready to be deployed publicly in a space the church deemed sacrosanct and safe by the oppressors. Her message is instantly verifiable and distributed en masse the moment it is sung. Historians still argue whether the Crown's failure to realize the sophistication of Mbori oral and musical traditions as communication networks was a fatal flaw in their intelligence gathering, or simply an inevitable consequence of deep-seated colonial racism that dismissed indigenous culture as primitive. Their focus was Linnean letters, documents, and wires, while the real action was happening in the harmonics. You see a notice tacked up on the mission board, an official proclamation from the governor warning of severe penalties for spreading rumors or seditious reports. The language is stern, designed to instill fear. Mir glances at it, a gentle trace of sarcasm flickering across her lips. She has just completed a service where she announced a successful capture of a British field gun. News far more important than any rumor. She realizes the government is censoring the truth precisely because the truth is what her people need most. She is providing the resistance with something censorship cannot touch: reliable, moral-boosting facts. Every time the Peak read a sanitized official report, they are lulled into a false sense of security. Every time Mir sings, her people receive the unvarnished truth, woven into the fabric of the colonists' own worship. It is a stunning triumph of indigenous resourcefulness over the suffocating control of the colonial state. She walks away from the notice, the message of defiance secured not on paper, but in the melody of her memory. To truly grasp the power of Mir's coded communication, you must anchor it in the mainstream historical fact of the use of Waiata song in Mbori culture. Song was not a frivolous art form. It was the essential medium for preserving history, expressing emotion, performing rituals, and commenting on contemporary life. When you hear a traditional Waiata, you are hearing a living document, a complex repository of lineage, grievance, or praise. Mir's action is not an imported European espionage technique. It is a profound application of indigenous cultural practice to a colonial problem. Imagine the traditional setting. An elder stands before the community and sings a Waiata tangi lament about a recent loss. This song is meticulously structured, referencing specific ancestors, locations, and events. It is a form of oral history that is instantly understood, memorized, and passed down. Mir is tapping into this deep-seated cultural instinct, making her coded hymns immediately intelligible and entirely trustworthy to her audience. The fact that the most vital news was communicated through song made it culturally appropriate and therefore instantly credible. This cultural rootedness provided a powerful defense against detection. The Peak settlers, coming from a tradition where songs were often seen as mere entertainment or religious ornamentation, could never conceive of the spiritual melody carrying a precise military intelligence brief. They dismissed the indigenous mode of communication out of hand. A quirky or fringe tidbit that often appears in Waiata scholarship is the use of place names Trangawawe as powerful compressed symbols. A single reference to a mountain or a river within a traditional song could summon an entire history of tribal claims, battles, and spiritual significance. Mir employed this expertly by subtly shifting a generic biblical term like mountain of strength to a Māori phrase naming a specific local manga mountain that was a current resistance stronghold. She was instantly broadcasting its location and status to her people, all while the peak heard only a general religious metaphor. You watch Mir, her face serene, her voice perfectly modulated. She is not just singing, she is practicing Wakapapa genealogy, connection through sound. Her coded news maintains the structure and emotional gravity of a true Waiata, ensuring its integrity and memory among the Māori listeners. She is fulfilling a traditional role of the kaikarero, speaker, storyteller, but using a modern medium. Historians still argue whether the spiritual potency of Waiota contributed to the memory, retention, and rapid dissemination of Mir's coded lyrics, effectively ensuring that her audience could not forget the news she conveyed. Music, being a powerful mnemonic device, made her intelligence unforgettable. The service is reaching its climax. The hymn, ostensibly about the unity of the church, is actually being used to consolidate the political unity of the Kinjatonga movement. Mir's phrasing is subtly drawing attention to the unity of the Māori people, using words that denote collective strength and shared ancestry. This is an act of defiance, cloaked in conformity. You feel the deep satisfaction of the Māori elders in the back. They are participating in their traditional communication ritual, empowered and informed, while the oppressors are unknowingly providing the platform. The music fades, and the traditional way of speaking triumphs over colonial attempts at control. Mir's genius lies in her ability to make the new technology the mission hymn serve the ancient cultural imperative of Wyatt. Mir's extraordinary run of success was almost derailed by a single suspicious individual. The peak choir director, Mr. Thomas. You are now focused on this quirky or fringe tidbit, the man who came closest to cracking the code. Not through language, but through music. Mr. Thomas was a meticulous man, obsessed with rhythmic and tonal perfection. Unlike the Rev Davies, who listened for spiritual feeling, Thomas listened for technical precision. The mainstream historical fact that saved Mir was the general musical illiteracy among the settler population. They recognized a tune, but rarely analyzed its harmonic or rhythmic structure. Thomas, however, was trained in the formal European tradition of music theory. He started noticing anomalies that the others dismissed as church acoustics. He observed that during certain hymns, Mir's alto line seemed to possess a subtle, unsettling variation in rhythm, not enough to throw the entire choir off, but enough to make the passage feel momentarily unsquare. Specifically, he detected a slight elongation of a key syllable or a micro-delay in the onset of a new phrase. This fractional rhythmic anomaly was Mir's way of ensuring the inserted Māori words, which often had different syllable counts or stress patterns than the original English, fit the overall melodic frame. You see Mr. Thomas during a rehearsal. He stops the choir mid-hymn. Miss Mir, he says, tapping his baton sharply on the lectern. Could you sing that phrase again? Just the fourth line. Mir's heart pounds, but her expression remains calm. She sings the line perfectly, executing the substitution, which translates roughly to, "The path of the scout is secure." Thomas frowns. No, I feel a slight rubato on the word Lord. It's meant to be sung quite strictly, on the beat. He is sensing her rhythmic marker, the slight hesitation that signals a code is being deployed. This man, the spy who almost caught her, was listening to the musical structure while everyone else was listening to the religious message. Mir responds with immediate, humble apologies, using the very sarcasm that protects her. "Oh, my apologies, Mr. Thomas. I was so caught up in the feeling of the Lord's majesty that I allowed my timing to waver. I will be more disciplined." She subtly blames her excessive piety, an explanation entirely acceptable and even praiseworthy in the eyes of the missionaries. Crucially, Thomas's suspicion was focused on rhythmic or tonal anomalies, never on the actual words. Historians still argue whether, if Mr. Thomas had possessed fluency in Te Reo and Bori, he would have been the first to break the code, or if his focus on the technical music would have still blinded him to the linguistic substitution. He was listening to how she sang, but not what she sang. You observe Mir making a mental adjustment. The close call with Thomas forces her to refine her method further. She realizes she must minimize the rhythmic shifts and rely almost entirely on phonetic substitution and pitch variation like the minor key markers. She must make the rhythm entirely seamless, absorbing any necessary adjustments by slightly compressing or elongating her vowels without altering the tempo. It's a minor difference, but it saves her life. The next Sunday, the hymn comes. Mr. Thomas is watching Mir like a hawk, his foot tapping in perfect time. She sings the line, executing the coded message perfectly, her rhythm flawless. Thomas nods, satisfied. He thinks he has corrected a musical flaw. In reality, he has just ensured the smooth transmission of intelligence regarding a planned surprise attack near the coast. The choir director remains an unwitting security guard, listening so hard for the rhythm that he remains utterly deaf to the treason carried in the sound. You step back now to consider the overarching consequences of Mir's work, which brings us to the core scholarly debate surrounding her impact. It's as impossible to precisely measure the effect of coded songs because the evidence is auditory and ephemeral. Historians still argue whether Mir's specific localized intelligence actually changed the outcome of any major battle, or if it primarily served to boost the morale and resilience of the Mbori resistance. The mainstream historical fact is that the New Zealand Wars were ultimately a colonial victory, resulting in massive land confiscations and the suppression of the Kingitanga's immediate military power. However, to judge Mir's contributions solely on the final outcome is to misunderstand the nature of warfare. Her intelligence was not about winning the war outright. It was about prolonging the resistance, minimizing losses, and ensuring the key leaders and infrastructure of the Mbori movement survived to fight the political and diplomatic battles that followed. Consider the intelligence she delivered. News of weakened supply lines, troop positions, and the fate of captured soldiers. This kind of information allows commanders to avoid ambushes, execute successful raids on isolated garrisons, and preserve precious resources. While a single piece of intelligence rarely changes the tide of a major campaign, a continuous, reliable flow of tactical data can certainly prevent a swift, decisive defeat. A quirky or fringe tidbit that supports the morale argument is the enduring tradition of waiata that emerged from the wars. Many songs composed during and immediately after the conflicts, even if they don't explicitly mention Mir, speak of the power of Carrero communication and secret knowledge to sustain the people. The mere knowledge that a vital, safe channel of communication existed, operating right under the enemy's nose, was a powerful psychological weapon. It reinforced the belief that the Mbori people, despite their lack of modern resources, possessed a superior intellectual and cultural cunning. The debate centers on the concept of strategic survival. Those who argue for a major military impact point to specific Mbori victories where a surprise element was crucial, suggesting Mir's information was key. Those who emphasize the morale factor argue that the greatest victory was the cultural one, the maintenance of hope, and the transmission of a unified narrative during a period when the colonial administration was trying to shatter Mbori identity and unity through censorship and confiscation. You realize that the true answer likely lies in the middle. Mir's intelligence enabled the resistance to be more tactically effectively allowing them to strike with precision, but its lasting impact was spiritual and psychological. She made the Mbori people feel informed, seen, and connected at a time when the colonial machine was trying to isolate and confuse them. You listen again to the ghost of the coded hymn. It's a perfect example of gentle sarcasm against the historical record itself. The official peak histories record the ultimate victory of the crown. But Mir's silent work ensures that the indigenous record holds a counter-narrative, a tale of resourceful defiance. The impact of her hidden stories was not measured in land won or lost, but in the flame of resistance that refused to go out. Her greatest legacy is the preservation of the will to fight another day, sung beautifully in four-part harmony. Following the devastating intelligence of Rangiriri, Mir's role shifts dramatically. She must move the focus of her lyrical updates from conveying defeat to communicating the need for sustained resilience. You are now witnessing her mastery of psychological warfare through music. The mainstream historical fact is that after the initial large-scale defeats, the Māori resistance, particularly under the umbrella of the Kingitanga, transitioned to guerrilla tactics, relying on mobility, deep knowledge of the terrain, and strategic patience. Mir's hymns become the operational directive for this strategic shift. She now selects hymns characterized by endurance and steadfastness, avoiding those focused on immediate, glorious victory. She chooses songs about weathering storms, remaining faithful during exile, or waiting patiently for divine deliverance. The original lyrics, intended to bolster spiritual perseverance, become the perfect framework for a political and military message of protracted resistance. When she sings a hymn verse about the slow journey through the desert, she is not just referring to the biblical Exodus. She is coding news about the difficult, intentional retreat of forces into the rugged, inaccessible interior known as the King Country Tero Pata. The phrase she substitutes roughly translates to, "The path of the warriors is now inward. Plant deep the seeds of our future." This message tells her people to stop preparing for fixed battles and start preparing for long-term self-sufficiency and continued political autonomy in their protected territory. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this era is the reliance of the retreating Mbori forces on traditional cultivation techniques to feed their soldiers and maintain a mobile civilian population. They understood that sustaining the fight meant sustaining the people. Mere S-coded message to plant deep the seeds may have been a direct instruction about the need to shift to more robust food supplies and secure their Maracay food gardens in preparation for years of conflict. You observe the subtle change in her performance. Her voice, while still beautiful, loses the soaring triumph of the Gepa days and gains a deep, resonant maturity of voice of solemn commitment. She is singing to an audience that is weary but not broken. The peak here, an increase in their Mbori converts' piety, interpreting the deeper, somber tone as genuine spiritual submission to colonial authority. They are reassured that the defeats have finally broken the Mbori spirit. Historians still argue whether the spiritual language used by Mir, particularly the emphasis on endurance and eventual justice, helped cement the Kinjatanga as a viable political entity that survived the war, ultimately negotiating its own terms of peace and recognition. The coded hymns provided a powerful, unifying narrative that went far beyond military strategy. This is Mir's most empathetic performance. She is using the music to soothe the collective trauma of defeat, while simultaneously injecting the essential hard news needed for strategic realignment. She is transforming the colonial weapon, the hymn, into a blueprint for cultural and physical survival. Her gentle sarcasm is directed at the colonial delusion that their military victories translate into spiritual conquest. She is singing about surrender while detailing the strategy for the next 20 years of resistance. The relentless pressure of her double life inevitably led to a close call. A moment of pure, blinding panic when her carefully constructed linguistic shield nearly crumbled. You are standing in the church as a local peak settler, Mr. Harrington, a former schoolmaster known for his meticulous, if annoying, attention to detail, raises a question after the final hymn. The mainstream historical fact is that the complexity of colonial English grammar was often seen as a marker of civilization, and Mr. Harrington, steeped in this pedantry, chooses to focus on an altered stanza's grammatical structure. Mir had just delivered an urgent message concerning the location of a hidden Mbori arsenal, a vital piece of intelligence embedded in a hymn about the Father's flawless design. The original line had a straightforward, subject-verb construction. Mir's altered phrase, in Mbori, carried the news but required a slightly inverted word order to maintain the original English rhythm. The resulting English sound that the peak heard was, "His great strength, now by the waters, is renewed." The original uncoded line was something like, "His great strength is renewed by the living waters." Mr. Harrington stands up, clearing his throat. "Reverend Davies," he says, "I must confess that final stanza, while beautiful, struck me as grammatically unsound. The phrasing, 'His great strength now by the waters, is renewed.' The adverbial phrase is oddly placed. It feels clumsy. Surely the original text does not sanction such a divergence from proper syntax. The air freezes. This is the danger, not the meaning, but the perceived flaw. Mir is put in immediate danger because the man correctly identified a linguistic anomaly, even if he attributed it to poor translation or performance. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit of how minor human errors' linguistic clumsiness nearly exposed one of history's most brilliant spies. Mir must act instantly. She steps forward, her face a picture of humility and apology. "Oh, Mr. Harrington," she says in flawless apologetic English, "I am so sorry. That was entirely my fault. I was responsible for writing out a fresh copy of the sheet music for the choir director this week, and I confess I transcribed the words incorrectly. I misplaced the comma and the prepositional phrase. She quickly generates a plausible, innocent error that blames her own clerical skills rather than the code. She adds, with a touch of gentle sarcasm, that the complexity of the English language sometimes eludes even the most diligent of students. The Reverend Davies, relieved that the spiritual feeling of his service is not being questioned, waves it away. "My dear Mere, your devotion more than makes up for a misplaced comma, Mr. Harrington. We must remember that the spirit is more important than the letter of the law." The issue is dismissed as a clerical error by a well-meaning native. Historians still argue whether Mr. Harrington had a genuine subconscious sense of the deeper semantic shift, or if he was simply a pedant who happened to stumble upon the weak point in Mere's rhythmic execution. Regardless, the close call forced Mere to internalize the need for absolute grammatical integrity in her English facade, realizing that the pedantry of her enemies was as dangerous as their muskets. You watch Mere retreat back to her seat, her hands trembling slightly, hidden beneath the hem. She knows that her quick thinking saved her, but the warning is clear. She must ensure that the subtle inversions required for her coded Mbori phrases are perfectly disguised by an equally perfect English sound. From this point forward, the code must not just sound like a hymn, it must sound like a grammatically correct hymn, adding yet another layer of complexity to her task. The incident passes, but the terror lingers. The sound of her deception had been questioned, and the silence now carries the weight of near discovery. The nature of the intelligence Mere transmits is constantly changing as the war evolves. Following the strategic retreats and the emphasis on endurance, remember Section 18. Her coded focus shifts from tactical battlefield logistics to news concerning the safety and movements of key Mbori leaders. Most importantly, the king. This is a critical pivot because the survival of the Kinjatanga movement now depends more on the preservation of its political head than on the defense of any single piece of territory. The mainstream historical fact is that the British colonial government recognized that capturing or eliminating the king was the fastest route to ending the organized resistance. Tuiao, the second Mbori king, became the ultimate symbol of sovereignty and defiance. His location and safety were the most valuable pieces of information for both sides. Mere's new mission is to use the hymns to provide regular coded reassurance that the king is safe and leading the people. She uses religious imagery with extreme care now, ensuring the references are instantly recognizable to her Mbori listeners. A hymn stanza about the shepherd who guides his flock through the darkness is now coded to explicitly signal the king's current location, perhaps deep within the King Country sanctuary. She must change the word for shepherd to an honorific that translates as the chief, the unbroken line, and then follow it with a substitution that confirms his position near a known natural landmark signaling. The king is safe by the falls of the Kahu. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the colonial perception of Tuiao's flight. The British often portrayed him as a fugitive, hiding in fear. Mere's coded songs countered this narrative by emphasizing his strategic leadership and spiritual strength, transforming his retreat into a principled act of sovereignty. The hymns become a public, covert acknowledgement of his continued legitimacy, crucial for maintaining the unity of the resistance tribes who might otherwise drift away without visible proof of his command. You are acutely aware that the stakes are now even higher. If Mere inadvertently leaks the king's true location, the consequences would be catastrophic for the entire Kinjatanga movement. Every alteration must be flawless. She employs her most sophisticated rhythmic and tonal markers. Remember the lessons learned from Mr. Thomas in Section 16. To ensure that the vital location data is received without error, historians still argue whether the spiritual authority Mere conveyed through the hymns significantly enhanced the political authority of Tuiao during his time of exile. Reinforcing the belief that these spiritual forces were on the side of the Mbori monarchy, it was a communication of divine sanction for his continued rule. You watch as the service unfolds. The chosen hymn is long, a narrative piece about a saint's journey. Mere knows her window is small. She delivers the coded message about Tuiao's location in the middle of the third verse, her voice steady. The gentle sarcasm here is aimed directly at the colonial intelligence agents, who are hunting Tuiao across the remote bush, unaware that his coordinates have just been sung aloud, perfectly disguised as an ode to a distant biblical king. The Māori listeners in the back nod, taking silent comfort in the news. The king is safe. The resistance is unbroken. The hymns, once a symbol of colonial cultural invasion, are now the unbreachable fortress guarding the lifeblood of Mbori political survival. You are now delving into the deeper mechanism that made Mir's work so devastatingly effective, the power of music and memory. This is a mainstream psychological fact. Music, particularly melody and rhythm, is one of the most powerful memory aids known to humankind. The melodic structure acts as a hook onto which complex, easily forgettable linguistic data like military intelligence can be securely attached. Think about how easily you remember the lyrics to a song you haven't heard in 20 years versus how quickly you forget a list of bullet points. The music provides the effective rhythmic scaffolding, making the recall automatic and effortless. Mir was not just delivering news, she was making that news unforgettable and instantly retrievable by linking it to the familiar repeated tunes of the mission hymns. The rhythmic structure of the hymns, with their predictable meters like common meter or long meter, forced a certain uniformity onto the words. When Mir coded a message about a supply cache location, the rhythm of the tune itself dictated the number of syllables, the stress pattern, and the duration of each word. Her Māori listeners were primed by their own Waiata tradition, which relied heavily on memory and rhythm to internalize this sonic data instantly. A quirky or fringe tidbit that supports this is the psychological phenomenon of the earworm, or involuntary musical imagery. Because the hymns were so repetitive and pervasive in colonial life, the tunes were constantly cycling in people's minds. For the Mbori listeners, this meant the coded message was also being constantly involuntarily rehearsed. The news about the king's safety, or a planned ambush, was not a static piece of information. It was a recurrent humming thought, ensuring the intelligence remained fresh and accurate until it could be acted upon. You watch as Mir's network members silently practice the coded hymns. They are untrying to remember the phrase, "The king is safe," by the falls of the Kahu. They are remembering the melody that phrase is attached to, and the words simply ride on the back of the music. It's a genius application of cognitive science to wartime necessity. Historians still argue whether the high retention rate of the coded messages among the Mbori communities was primarily due to the musical structure or the high emotional importance of the intelligence being conveyed. It was likely a synergistic effect. Music enhanced the memory of emotionally resonant news. You realize the profound safety this system provided. A man asked to memorize a string of dates and places might forget them under pressure. But a person who has internalized a melody that is reinforced publicly every son, the information effortlessly. The gentle sarcasm against the peak reaches a peak here. They enforced a system of music and public ritual precisely because they believed it would bind the Mbori to their cause. But that very system became the engine of their own intelligence failure. Mir's choice of music was her ultimate weapon. She chose tunes that would stick in the mind, ensuring the survival of the intelligence long after the sound waves had dissipated. The power of the hidden song was the power of deep, lasting memory. As the intense phase of the New Zealand Wars drew to a close and the colonial administration gained control over the narrative, Mir's extraordinary story fell victim to what you can call post-war amnesia. This is the sad, crucial fringe tidbit of history, the deliberate suppression or simple forgetting of indigenous acts of resistance, and heroism that didn't fit the convenient colonial storyline of pacification and submission. The mainstream historical fact is that the colonial government and its historians were eager to publish accounts of the wars that emphasized British valor, missionary success, and the ultimate inevitable triumph of civilization. A story about a humble Māori choirgirl who outsmarted the entire military intelligence apparatus using their own sacred music would have been deeply embarrassing and counterproductive to the official narrative. It would suggest that the Mbori were not only fierce fighters, but also intellectual equals capable of profound cunning. You realize that Mir was forgotten not because she was unsuccessful, but because she was too successful at demonstrating indigenous intellectual superiority. Her existence as a successful spy challenged the fundamental colonial assumption of racial and cultural hierarchy. Imagine the historical record being written. The missionaries certainly didn't write about her. They had too much invested in her being a genuine, submissive convert. To admit she was a spy would invalidate their life's work, remember Section 6. The colonial military certainly didn't write about her, as admitting that their defeats were caused by intelligence leaks delivered by a teenage girl in a church would be humiliating. Her actions were too quiet, too subtle, and too successful to ever be formally documented by the enemy. She simply fades back into the records as mere, a faithful Māori Choirgirl. Her true wartime service entirely expunged from the written history books. This post-war silence is a profound example of historical suppression. The gentle sarcasm is sharp here. The greatest acts of indigenous brilliance were often those erased most thoroughly from the written record. Historians still argue whether the historical amnesia surrounding Mir was a conscious top-down conspiracy by colonial officials, or if it was simply a widespread, self-regulating mechanism of a society determined to forget any fact that contradicted its own self-image as a benevolent, civilizing power. The truth is likely a combination of both. A willful act of forgetting, you understand that this forgetting is the final stage of her survival. By becoming invisible to history, she also secured her safety. Had her actions been widely known, she would have been labeled a traitor and hunted down even after the peace treaties were signed. Her legacy was preserved only in the deep, reliable channels of Māori oral tradition. A topic for the next section. You picture her years later, perhaps an old woman, attending church. She sings the same hymns, now truly singing the original lyrics of peace and devotion. But as she sings, the Māori elders around her look at her with profound respect, knowing the secret history contained within her quiet voice. They see the spy master, the communicator who helped their people endure. The written world forgot her, but the world of the Korero never did. Her fading from the public eye ensured the survival of her personal life, even as it erased her from the public script of the war. The war has dragged on, transforming from pitched battles to a stubborn, grinding guerrilla conflict. You are now present at the last service, a moment charged with a finality that transcends the ritual. The resistance is not defeated, but it is forced into a strategic peace, consolidating its sovereignty within the King Country sanctuarian area that remains virtually self-governed and off-limits to colonial authorities for years to come. Mir's communication network is no longer needed for urgent tactical data. Her final task is to sing a closing message of defiant hope. The mainstream historical fact is that the official end of the major campaigns was less a formal treaty and more a slow, weary tapering off of conflict, driven by both military attrition and financial exhaustion on the colonial side. The atmosphere is one of uneasy coexistence rather than outright reconciliation. The peak settlers feel they have won the land. The Māori resistance feels they have preserved their future. Mir chooses a hymn that speaks of future glory and the eventual certain victory of good over evil. The original is a plea for the millennium. She transforms it into a prophetic closing statement for her people. Her substitutions are broad and inspirational, focusing not on a location, but on a promise. She ensures her final coded message is one of endurance, unity, and a defiant commitment to cultural survival. The altered line, sung with profound emotion, is a commitment to the enduring mana prestige power of the Kinjatanga, a promise that the spiritual war will continue even if the shooting stops. It translates roughly to, "We withdraw to the shelter. Our voice will return strong to reclaim the earth." This final message is crucial. It signals the cessation of active military espionage via the choir, confirming to the network that the mode of resistance has shifted. It tells the community that they must now rely on political and cultural strategies. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that after this period, many Māori leaders who retreated into the King Country, including Tuiao, became renowned for their poetic and prophetic waiata, often using riddles and metaphors. To talk about their political goals, continuing the tradition of coded cultural communication, Mir Esfanohim is the bridge between the wartime espionage of the church and the peacetime poetry of the resistance. You watch the mission pastor, unaware he is presiding over the final intelligence transmission of the war. He praises the beauty of Mir's voice and the spiritual assurance of the text. The gentle sarcasm is present one last time. He believes he is celebrating the establishment of permanent colonial peace, while Mir is announcing the opening of the next, more subtle phase of indigenous resistance. Historians still argue whether the Māori listeners understood the finality of this message, that the coded songs would stop, or if they waited anxiously for weeks for the next update. The fact that the communication line closed so deliberately and quietly is a testament to the discipline and trust within Mir's network. You feel the weight lift from her shoulders as the last note fades. She has carried secrets, grief, and hope for years, disguised as devotion. Her work is done. She closes the hymnal, not with relief, but with a quiet, fierce pride. The history of the war has been documented, not in the dusty ledgers of the colonial office, but in the echoes of her beautiful, subversive alto. Though silenced in the church and erased from colonial ledgers, Mir's history did not vanish. Her actions persisted primarily and powerfully through the legacy in the oral tradition, or correro. This is the mainstream historical fact of Māori culture. History is a living entity, preserved, refined, and transmitted through generations via spoken word, song, and genealogy, wakapapa. Her story became a proud part of the narrative of Tahu cunning and resistance. You follow the story into the heart of the King country, where the Kinjatunga remained politically independent for decades. Here, in the meeting houses, where in Nui, the elders tell the story of the great communicator. The girl who made the peak sing their own defeat. The specifics of the code, the exact rhythm and syllable substitutions, are slowly forgotten as the need for military intelligence recedes. But the fact of her genius and the lesson of her method are meticulously preserved. Imagine sitting by a fire in the Wairanui. An elder is telling the story, using Mir as a powerful, moral, and historical example. The key takeaway for future generations is not the military success, but the intellectual victory. The story proves that Māori intellectual superiority could subvert the most powerful symbols of colonial dominance. The hymns, the great weapons of the mission, were turned back on their masters. This is why her story endures. It's a blueprint for cultural resilience. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the specific reference to her in some localized Waiata composed long after the war. These songs would unname her directly to protect her legacy and privacy, but they would refer to the voice that brought news and the sound of the foreign prayer, or the singer of the double heart. These subtle references ensure that her name and role are recalled within the appropriate cultural context. Outside the gaze of the peak, historians still argue whether the Māori communities consciously protected the details of Mir's method to prevent the colonists from realizing the extent of their subversion, or if the method naturally faded as the cultural context for the hymns diminished over time. Regardless, the legacy of her action remains a source of immense pride. You realize that the true record of the New Zealand Wars is therefore dual: the written, official PK version of conquest and the vibrant oral Māori version of enduring survival. Mir's story is a central pillar of the latter. Her gentle sarcasm echoes across the decades. Woven into the correro, the enemy thought they were writing our history with their pens and muskets, but we were writing our survival into their Sunday sermon. She is remembered as a hero of wit and intelligence, a reminder that resistance comes in many forms, often the quietest. Her legacy demonstrates that when the written word is controlled by the oppressor, the power of music and memory, rooted in deep cultural tradition, becomes the ultimate vehicle for truth. The memory of the coded hymn survives, not as a military cipher, but as a potent cultural symbol. The final act of Mir's story is one of quiet, deliberate withdrawal. The long, agonizing conflict has ended, or at least subsided, into a political stalemate. You witness the quiet, deliberate cessation of the coded messages, allowing Mir to return to singing only the sacred words. She is no longer a spy. She is simply a faithful chorister. The mainstream historical fact is that the end of the war did not bring reconciliation, but a long, tense, often politically charged peace. The need for urgent military intelligence transmitted publicly vanished. To continue the code would be to risk its discovery now, in peacetime, which could jeopardize the delicate political truce and bring retribution on her community. Therefore, the network agrees to dissolve the intelligence operation. You are at a Sunday service, perhaps a year or two after the last shots were fired. The hymn is an earnest song of forgiveness and rebuilding, sung now in its original, unadulterated form. Mir's voice is still beautiful, still flawless, but the subtle rhythmic shifts, the momentary minority markers, and the cunning phonetic substitutions are gone. She sings the word peace, and it means only peace. She sings the word Lord, and it refers only to God. A quirky or fringe tidbit that often speaks to the residual tension is that for years after the war, Māori communities were wary of public speaking or singing, fearing that their words might be misconstrued or used against them by colonial authorities. Māori's deliberate return to orthodoxy in the mission church was a public signal to both sides, to the peak that the phase of outright defiance was over, and to her own people that the communication channel was closed and silence was now the safest strategy. The shift is profound. She is no longer carrying the weight of a nation's secrets in her throat. The physical and emotional pressure that had defined her every Sunday for years is released. You can see the change in her posture, less rigid, more genuinely relaxed. The gentle sarcasm is replaced by quiet resilience. The enemy's own music can no longer be used against them. The tool is retired, but the victory of its deployment remains secure in the memory of the resistance. Historians still argue whether Māori ever had to destroy any physical evidence of her code, perhaps a notebook, or marked music sheets, or if the entire system was kept purely in the minds of the handful of women, ensuring that nothing traceable ever existed. Given the sophistication of the operation, the latter is highly probable. You observe the final quiet scene. Māori is older now, a woman who played a pivotal, dangerous role in a crucial period of her people's history. She looks toward the back pews where the remaining elders sit. She catches their eye, and without a single coded note, she conveys a message of enduring love and respect. The war is over. The song has faded. The secret remains. The fading song winds down now. Let the image of that quiet church, with its smell of old wood and beeswax, begin to soften around the edges of your mind. We leave Māori there, a woman finally able to sing without deception, carrying the weight of a secret war in the peaceful rhythm of her heart. Take a slow, deep breath, letting the tension from her years of danger drain out of you. The history we uncover is often loud, full of cannon fire and marching feet. But sometimes, the most profound acts of courage are conducted in the softest tones, in places we least suspect. Māori's story reminds us that power is not just in the hands of those who write the law or command the army, but in the voices of those who, through sheer intelligence and cultural genius, find ways to use the oppressors. Tools against them, turning hymns into rallying cries. As the music fades entirely, leaving only the quiet ring of silence in the empty church, know that the most vital parts of history are often found not in the written books, but in the echoes of the memory passed down from generation to generation. Her secret is safe now, settled into the deep, fertile ground of Carrero. The war is long finished, the land still contested, but the truth of the clever choir girl endures. There is no need for worry now. The secrets are quiet, the melody is soft, and you are safe here.